Thank you. So I'm aware I'm the third speaker in a row and that I'm keeping you from going to lunch, so I'll try and be brief and painless. So I'm going to go straight into a couple of stories about data that I find fascinating. For the first one, no, that's the wrong one. The first one happened in America, New Orleans, 2005, when Katrina was bringing a lot of destruction to Louisiana. This was described as the worst disaster in American history by the US Congress. And what happened here was that the state and the federal government were not prepared, and they were quite late at bringing relief to the area. So people on the ground started to organize to try and bring help to the area most affected. Now, to try and find out what were the areas most affected, they started scraping data from government websites, from PDFs, things like building permits, population estimates, what they call the parcel layer, so let's say maps. And they reassembled this data into Excel spreadsheets and CSV files. And they shared this data among them in order to help reach the area most affected. And I think this is, in a way, the defining moment of the open data movement. Of course, it's a much less mature movement than it is today. It was all about community, all about sharing. It was all about taking stuff from the government and using it. So let's fast forward to 2013. The movement is much more mature, and there's a story that I quite like about fatbergs. Fatbergs are big balls of fat that form in the drain whenever cooking oils are disposed of incorrectly. You might remember this from the press. A fatberg the size of a double-decker was found in the drains in London. But actually, in New York, this happened to be quite a frequent issue. The frequent issue caused by restaurants dumping oils illegally. The reason for that is there's a huge bureaucracy and high costs involved. But if you think that there are 25,000 restaurants just in Manhattan, you see that's almost impossible it's not practical anyway, to try and inspect them, to chase whoever is responsible. So two high officials in New York City, the chief of planning and the chief analytics officer, I think, decided to have a look at data and see, can we actually solve this problem using data? And they gathered about 50 data scientists, gave them access to the data sources that form intelligence about this problem. So we're talking about waste management, we're talking about pollution, restaurant licenses. And these data scientists produced some sort of treasure map identifying what were the restaurants responsible for the illegal dumping of oil. This has also changed the way New York now approaches problems, and data has been started to be used in a number of other issues like crime detection, crime prevention, finding out tobacco smugglers, for example. So this story is quite interesting because you can see that the gap between 2005 and 2013. There's now leadership. We're talking about two senior officials in New York City decided to use data as a way to solve a problem. But there's also outreach. There is positive engagement with the community in order to solve a problem that is affecting everyone. And it's also about transformation. Transformation under 2 points of view. First of all, it's about bringing about positive change to society, but it's also about transforming old ways of dealing with problems. So this is just a brief introduction to try and introduce the topic of this talk. I'd like to give you pointers to answer this question. How can data fulfill its promises? And I will be using data and open data almost interchangeably in this talk because I think that openness is just one phase of a wider move towards data. Actually, I think that openness was, in a way, the Trojan horse that allowed data to become mainstream within government. So, as I've been introduced, I'm here as a member of the former Open Data User Group. We were an advisory panel at Cabinet Office. We helped them with open data transparency policy. We've been responsible for prioritizing data releases. But one thing we did, as you can see, this is us, a brief description of who we were. A very diverse group in terms of skills and industry. One thing we did was to try and help the government answer this question. So there was an approach around funding open data that in the early 2010 was quite important. The reason was open data was perceived to be something expensive, something that departments would do, let's say, as a side project, so they needed money for it. So there was this attempt to inject money into the data release process, funding projects that could show some positive examples of that data use, reuse, and capability building around some sort of open data process. This all comes from the budget in 2011, which was quite an intense budget in terms of data. You might remember the Open Data Institute was originally funded there. Other initiatives like the Innovation Vouchers or the Open Data Challenge Series received their first funding. But two funds were specifically set aside for data release projects. And we were basically asked to administer the £7 million for the release of data fund. So I'm going to give you some gallery of projects we funded, because I think they represent some interesting uses of data around the country. The first one I'd like to talk about is from the Local Government Association. This was a project where they bid for £700,000 with the idea of building a release process for local authorities. So it was quite interesting in terms of capacity building. It was about trying to have one single process for everyone. They've been very successful. Over 1,000 data sets have been released so far. But what was very interesting about this process, and I'm sure Jackie will be able to comment further because she was involved with this, was the consultation approach. So they first of all reached out to the local authorities to ask what are the most commonly requested data sets, for example by FY. And three teams emerged. And I think there are three very interesting themes. The first one is planning applications. I think people want to know if their neighbors are going to take a basement extension, for example, and they often request data about this. The second one, pub licenses. There are a lot of requests around any premise using alcohol, but the most commonly requested theme, actually, do you have any idea what this might be?
Toilets.
Exactly. How do you know that? Public toilets. People want to know where's the nearest public toilet and what the opening time of that toilet. And I mean, honestly, this is big. I mean, every local authority is receiving requests around this. But jokes aside, this is also a very interesting example in terms of licensing. Because we had to stop this project for a while because of an interesting licensing issue around ordnance survey. So most local authorities use ordnance survey products at their geographical intelligence base. I mean, their products are pretty much pervasive. And there were huge restrictions on the possible use that councils could do of the data extracted out of this system. That problem was resolved by Ordnance Survey happily granting an exemption. Now they're moving towards the open government license. But this is very interesting because it really suggests how sometimes even releasing a very simple, I would say very stupid data set can find extremely difficult hurdles in terms of licensing. The second project I'd like to talk about, Open Addresses. This guys tried to build a crowdsourced national address dataset, releases an open dataset. There is a bit of background around this. Since 2012, we have been arguing that addresses are very important. They underpin a number of other datasets. They underpin a lot of activities. So an address dataset is actually very important in terms of economic power, in terms of public services. In general, also, I mean, you probably can't read this, but the idea is one of the most frequent class of data being requested on DataGovUK was actually around two datasets: the National Property and Land Gazetteer on one side and the postal address file from Royal Mail on the other side. So a dataset that contain addresses, both of which were not openly available. They were actually under paywall without an open license. In 2013, Royal Mail was privatized, and when rumors around the privatization started to circulate, we strongly argued that the postal address file should be kept separate from the rest of Royal Mail for two reasons. First of all, as I said, because it's very important from an operational point of view for the public sector, but also because it hadn't been compiled and assembled using taxpayers' money. We lost the battle. There is still no national open address dataset. Open addresses have not been so far commercially successful. They've gone in hibernation mode, but they've been very good at highlighting this problem once again. And I think this is one of the priority for whoever wants to take the open agenda further. This brings me to a very interesting project that was started by Trafford Council. They came to us with a request for £50,000, which is a reasonably low amount, with the idea of building a lab within a local authority. So what is a lab? A lab is a place where people from the council, employees from the council, discuss how to make sure that the council moves to using data in its operations. But it's also a new way of engaging with the local community. They run data surgeries. They are inviting people from the community, charities, social enterprises to go there and present the problems that they can resolve with data. And the Trafford Lab helps them finding out, sourcing the data, and releases the data as with an open license when possible. They've had some interesting results of this. One of the most famous results of the Trafford Lab has been finding out where to put defibrillators in public locations. They've run a collaboration between housing officers, public health, and ambulances. And I've been told that this has saved lives in at least a couple of cases. But they've also started to work on the ongoing aspect of data. They now run this constant demographic profiling of wards around Trafford. And this has resulted in an interesting project for reducing the isolation in the elderly. The data was used by charities working with the elderly. Another example of what they're using the data for, which I can't really show because it contains lots of private data as well, has been trying to harmonize the cervical cancer screening rates across the whole of Trafford. They discovered using public health data that these screening rates were widely varying between different areas, and they've worked with GPs in order to target patients all across the city. This project is a lot about transformation. As I said, once again, it's about transformation in a sense of bringing positive change to the community, but it's also about starting to discuss how council can operate in different ways by using data. Leeds Data Mill, probably one of the most successful non-governmental data repository. Mark Barrett, I don't know if he's around, he was outside, is one of the sponsors today. He built this about a year ago. And this is very interesting because it's the first case of a citywide data repository. It brings together data from the public and the private sector. In this context, mostly utilities. So there are live feeds of incidents from Northern Power Grid or Yorkshire Water. And this is very interesting because it's what a smart city power station should look like. Having data from all across the spectrum in order to deliver services for the residents. One final project I'd like to mention from the Environment Agency, it was a project of building the capacity of releasing open data and specifically the National Flood Risk Dataset. This is a dataset that is now used by planning officers, it's used by insurances in order to calculate premium. But what's very interesting is what it could do for society and for communities. You might remember the Somerset floods in 2013. If we release this data as open data, communities will be able to start planning and reacting to the risk, to their own risk. And I think it's very important in order to create a sort of cooperation and engagement with local communities. So there are many more projects. I won't be able to talk about them all. They are very diverse. They bid for a very different amount of money and with very different outcomes. But some lesson we can learn from them is that, first of all, we haven't seen any revolutionary use of data. There hasn't been, people saved from a hurricane. We haven't seen any multi-billion pound business created out of data. But in a way, I think that that's actually what makes data powerful. Data is something that changes the way services run in the long term. There was a colleague on the Open Data User Group who used to say that data is boring. And I think that's actually the nature of data. It's about the long term rather than some immediate revolution. The second lesson is about how costs of using data and releasing data are not necessarily related to the utility of that data. In general, I would say that it's relatively cheap to release data whenever data is embedded in the way the service is run. In the early 2010s, as I've said, there was a lot of worry around the cost of open data because open data was mostly done to release data to the public rather than for using the data internally. And things are changing as we adopt more data within public services. Lesson 3, establishing processes is hard. We haven't seen much processes around data using and data releasing within this project, with maybe the exclusion of Trafford. There is a fantastic example of this in the public sector in the UK. The Health and Social Care Information Centre have built a huge framework where they describe how they generate, use, and release data sets. There are these very long documents where they describe things like who's the authority, what's the accountability, and the quality control on data. But that's a unique experience, and I think we are slowly seeing more of this, but it's still quite hard. And lesson number 4, of course, use your own data. That's what Trafford are doing. Whenever data is embedded in public services, in the ongoing tasks that any authority is running, it makes much cheaper and much easier to then release this data to the public. So, the future. Jack, we remember that. That's from GovCamp 2015. We ran this session discussing the future of open data. That's the outcome of that session. You can see it's very messy. It's quite complex to decipher because, yes, data can go in many directions. But one question emerged from that chat is, do we need to reboot the open data or the data agenda in general? Well, I think probably not to reboot, but in a way we need to nudge it in the right direction because things are a bit sleeping at the moment. Data is coming in phases. This shouldn't really look like this, but okay, well, I'll describe. So I think the first wave of data was all about open data. It was about isolated data releases. It was about data catalogs to find those releases. It was motivated by transparency. So most of these data sets are data sets that have to do with spending. And the issue here, given that it was data that was not used internally, it was all around accuracy. So what the second wave of data should look like? Well, it should be less about open data and more about data in general. So when we have isolated data releases, we should see more data processes. Data catalogs should be replaced by data frameworks, as we've seen with the Health and Social Care Information Centre. Transparency will still be important, but as data starts to be used by public services, we will have a lot of operational data. And as a consequence of that, accuracy will no longer be the major worry. Privacy will be, as operations starts dealing with more personal data. We might get there, we're not there yet. And I'd like now to do some little bit of government bashing in this. There are some worrying signs, some not extremely positive signs I'd like to discuss. The first one is transparency. During the previous parliament, there was a lot of attention around openness, around transparency, and around data. Francis Moore, the Cabinet Office Minister, was really keen on this. He managed to keep this right in the very short ministerial attention span. I'm not sure that things are moving the same way. One negative sign about this is what's happening around the Freedom of Information Act. The discussion around the Freedom of Information Act, the Commission has been set to review it. It's all discussion that is about, are we sure that FOI is the right thing? One of the members, Jack Straw, has been on public record saying that he would like to restrict the FOI. Now, of course, FOI and open data are two different things, but they are driven by the same transparency ethos. And I think that the transparency ethos is also important whenever we don't talk about open data, but we talk about data in general, because it's what allows the public to have confidence in what we're doing with data. The second sign I'd like to discuss is that about the Chief Data Officer. Now, you remember, end of 2014, France appointed their first Chief Data Officer, and all of a sudden, the whole UK data community was panicking about, we need one, to the point that Chief Data Officer became some sort of hot potato that had to land on someone. That someone was Mike Bracken, who was then the Chief Digital Officer as well. Now, I say this very respectfully. I blogged about this some time ago. I don't think that anyone can do those two jobs at the same time. They are full-time jobs with often competing drives and competing portfolios. However, as you know, Mike left the civil service, so we'd never get to that stage, and we've gone to a situation in which one person had two job titles without a post holder. We have some pointers from the US about what a chief data officer should do. Interestingly enough, the US have no chief data officer. They have a chief data scientist, which is a support figure. It's someone that, as the mission statement says, it supports the administration in responsibly unleashing the power of data for the benefit of the public and maximize the nation's return on investment in data. So it's an advocate. It's someone who monitors that data is used in a responsible way. I think that for the UK, we also should have someone who's an operations leader, someone who can manage a network of data officers in the whole public sector and tries and moves to a situation in which data is more used. The third point is about engagement. Now, I was a member of the Open Data User Group, but there were other panels. In 2013, there were 4 of them. APSI, the Data Strategy Board, the Public Sector Transparency Board, and the Open Data User Group. And one by one, these panels disappeared or were left to expire. Since May, there hasn't been any public appointed advisory panel on these topics. Now, advisory panels might not be the best way to engage with the open data community, but they are certainly one way. And that's something that hasn't had a replacement yet. So that's another sign that I find, in a way, worrying, the lack of engagement. How to move forward and to get back into positive mode. Simro is the coordinator of Democracy Club. Tracy, I think, knows him. He used to work for GDS as well. He said, open data isn't enough. We need to start with user needs and use open data as one tool. And I think that's exactly where we should head to with data. There has been a lot of talking about government as a platform. Government as a platform is a great vision of a more joined up thinking around digital services. Is a vision that requires, for example, systems to be built once rather than multiple times, so that there is some sort of sharing of resources across the public digital services. And of course, there is a need for a data layer to government as a platform. We, as Open Data User Group, argued quite strongly for having that sort of vision for the UK national information infrastructure. So the idea that data should underpin operations, it should be about building vocabularies that allow different services to communicate. It's about building a list of core reference data upon which services can be built. And as I have the same doubts that Jackie has about the idea that data is the new oil. I don't think that data is the new oil. Data is infrastructure. Data is like bridges, roads, railways, or pipes. It's something that takes effort to build. It's something that requires ongoing maintenance, and it's something that definitely can benefit the community in the long run by its transformative power. So to conclude this talk, some ongoing challenges. Well, the first one, wider adoption of data. There are many public services that could benefit from using data approach. And there is a lot of, not very joined up thinking in this. One example, electoral commission data. There's no easy way to find out open data about this. The second one is wider openness. As I said, the open agenda has been, in a way, the Trojan horse that let data into the mainstream in government. We need more of this. We need certainly a national address data set. We also need a better approach towards FOI. Last week, Terence Seaton, who's a software consultant, wrote this fantastic blog where he tells a story about his FOI request. I can't remember, it was something about parking. He placed the same request to 2 local authorities, receiving a response from one and the request being declined by the other. This is definitely something that should change. And finally, public trust. I think this is the challenge number 1. This is something I call the Overton window of data. What we as data specialists or data activists find comfortable doing is not necessarily what the public trust has to do. So there needs to be a high level of engagement, and I think this would be one of the major tasks for whoever is appointed Chief Data Officer next. And that's it for me. I'm happy to answer questions or to talk aside. Thank you.
Any questions for Giuseppe?
excellent presentation. I just want to make a few comments regarding your one of your last slides, which was around the first wave and second wave.
Okay, yeah, sorry, that was really bad.
And the thing about the second wave, I think I represent Kent County Council Public Health, and we feel that we're already moving towards the second wave. But I think special mention needs to be given to the fact that we are moving towards a revolution around how we're recognizing there is a lot of routine person-level administrative data across different public sector organizations. And there is a need to actually link those data sets at a person level for specialist users, particularly what was mentioned in the morning from the presentation from Downey, around prescriptive and predictive analytics. Much of what we do right now, particularly public health intelligence, is all around prescriptive and diagrammatic analytics, telling us there's a problem in the population and this is a problem, but we don't go as that far to actually really understand how do we apply that data for a more predictive or prescriptive purpose. And I think that the data that we use right now, which is all in a sort of siloed format, can't be used in that regard. It needs to be linked up at a person level. Yeah.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, on your first part of your comment, of course, there are parts of the public sector where the second wave has arrived already. It's more about harmonizing it and bringing everyone on board. And I mean, public health is certainly a great example of that. I mean, we've been working as well with the Public Health England. They were trying to use, in a better way, the cancer commissioning data, for example. I mean, there's a lot to be done, but as I said, it's also about bringing the public on board. The problem we had with Keynote was quite massive. I mean, there's a massive drop in trust from the public towards any data-oriented system, and that's something I think we should really work on.
Great to say. I think one of the things I wanted to add into that was the public toilets, which is a great hilarity, but actually what's happened with that data set is the GLA have got some funding from the Nominate Trust, and we've created the Great British Toilet now. And that is actually increasing the visitor population to some of the parts of the UK that weren't there before. But interestingly, the other thing that's happened set is supermarkets, banks, businesses have said, could we put our toilets on there? So we have some local councils who had to take the unfortunate decision to close public toilets because 40% of the costs require you to look at essential services. And so that's actually making a difference in some of those, those rural areas and the cities for that. So I just think that's an update.
Yeah, thanks.
I think partly I agree with the conclusion, but what I would say is I think we've made the open data case, but we haven't made the data case.
Absolutely.
And so the reason for the National Information Infrastructure was to pick up on the work that we did to create the data standards for our cities and actually say that has given us the case for this core capability, which in the same way that the banking infrastructure is seen as critical national infrastructure, we have to view data in that same way. And so I think that the case we made now, in some respects, yeah, I'm sad that all the advisory boards have gone down, but maybe that was right for that time.
For the time, yeah.
And I think the case is now, maybe I should have a presentation in the future that says open data and crosses it out and says data. Because I actually think we're beyond that a little bit, because open data takes us as a foundation a very long way. It's just not enough. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, really.
It's quite a good point. I mean, now there's a lot of... The thing is, the advisory panels were about engagement with the external world, while we now need something more focused on the internal side of things. And as I said, at the time, it was all motivated by transparency. So people wanting data, give us your data, we'll do something with it. Now it should be the other way around. We're using data internally. We will use that data to do some data releases, but that should be just, obvious and easy once you have those processes in place internally. So yeah, I agree with you on that.
great. I think that's all the time that we have.
Yes,
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much for your responses and also your questions.